this logic at the level of its subjective, its social, and its political consequences, we can see that the redistribution of the external boundaries of limited wholes, whether these wholes be countries, continents, or political alliances, has the immediate effect, if not of the complete breakdown of internal partitioning, at least a profound reorganization of the way those partitions are deployed. Hence, most obviously, in our instance, we see the effects of globalization removing the borders that previously separated individuals and peoples, whether physically or virtually. Seen most obviously in the current role of social networks, and here in our theme for the year, the role of the network in contrast to that of the border. So just as at the global level of the market, the parameters of space and time are reworked, far becomes near and near becomes far. So at the personal or subjective level, anybody can in principle become my neighbor. So on the one hand, we have the erosion of the principles of national sovereignty, the independence of the nation state itself, where legal sovereignty has always, or at least in the modern era, been tied to a determined and defined space of territory. And we know in the course of the last 2 decades, in the course of the economic crisis, the degree to which the market defies government and to some extent overthrows national government, not just at the level of the inability of local governments to extract tax from others in. But for our purpose, at the level of the subjective effects, now that just anyone can be my neighbor, near or far, real or virtual, how can this not have profound consequences on the space of traditional morality, organized in reference to the biblical commandment to love thy neighbor? We know that this commandment was already questioned by Freud. Why should I love my neighbor? Either because I don't even know him, or if I do, I'm not sure that I like him, or can even stand him.
But also because it says in the Bible, like yourself, love him as you love yourself. And Freud discovered that we don't love ourselves.
We don't love ourselves as part of the same logic. If we can follow through that version, that reflexive version, we'll see, because...
But it always appears.
Yes, but what we might try to track is the point at which, within the logic of globalization, that effect within the field of the not all becomes a little bit more unleashed. It's not limited in the same way. So it would be one way to situate the point at which this commandment to love thy neighbor tips over into the logic of racism and hatred, and effectively becomes hate thy neighbor, either because he's your mortal competitor in the struggle for limited resources, or because simply he's occupying my vital space. Hence, perhaps it's better to kill him to the extent that he poses a threat to us, poses a threat to me and to mine, to everything that I truly hold dear. And then even then, it's not as simple, shall we say, as the Christian commandment to love thy enemies. Because of the erosion of the logic of the exception, it means that even that fundamental distinction of being able to distinguish between friend and enemy has been undermined. The Carl Schmitt distinction that he tries to organize politics around, that distinction no longer functions, because the binary distinction between friend and enemy, us and them, which rests on the paranoid logic of the relation to a big other, no longer functions. Hence, we could say the final step of the same logic, as we move out of the defined space of a traditional master into the globalized logic of the not all, is that the only option left is to kill them all. To exterminate them, every last one of them, including ourselves if necessary, just to make sure. And it's at that point that that reflex of how can I love my neighbor because I don't love myself, because of the heart of evil that resides in my most intimate core. So yes, first, in the totalitarian logic, we try to wipe them all out. And eventually, as in the Stalinist sense, that logic carries us away too. And we've arrived at the logic of the politics of the death drive, which to some extent is exactly what Hannah Arendt had mapped without having the same formal logic to track some of those effects. But if nothing else, that effect helps us to locate what we could call a totalitarian logic at the heart of the globalized market, which turns out to be at some level a vehicle for the politics of the death drive, which opens the door to the unlimited jouissance of destruction, which, as I said, Hannah Arendt had located so precisely at the heart of the totalitarian movement, where she grasped that perhaps the most troubling thing about the appearance of totalitarian movements in history was that that movement was so difficult to counter, so difficult to limit, because it was never satisfied. To conclude, let's just say that this is the point at which the clinical questions of Lacanian psychoanalysis once again can be seen to intersect with the political questions, with the coordinates of the clinical questions that we have to deal with in the modifications within our clinic, which then might provide us with a more robust framework for considering, or a better oriented framework for considering some of the political questions that we find at stake in civilization today. It's also the zone in which, shall we say, those two discourses converge. It's no longer a question of the application of the one field to the other, of the clinical to the political, but to some extent both the clinical and the political are deployed within the same field, which turns out to be framed by the logic of the not all. So it becomes then a question of exploring, let's say, some of the implications and consequences of their conversion, of their convergence, something that Jacqueline Miller has been doing for some decades now, most obviously in the Milanese intuitions, but also in that key text, A Fantasy, from 2004, which is a text that